Hi guys, welcome back to the Literature Life. Today I have brought for you some relief from what students often consider to be one of the biggest, scariest, most complicated problems in literary theory. It is a critical concept developed by the French philosopher and literary critic Jacques Derrida in his 1967 book called Of Grammatology, and the name of this concept is, drum rolls, deconstruction. Alright, so I'm going to disappoint you a little bit, and I want to state honestly before even starting this video that anybody who tries to tell you that they are going to define deconstruction or they are going to tell you what deconstruction exactly means, if you find a person like that, run away from him. Okay, deconstruction cannot be defined in particular terms. Even Jacques Derrida, who tried to develop this concept, did not and could not define it in exact terms. All right, we can discuss what all is involved in deconstruction. We can discuss the various aspects of deconstruction. We can see how Derrida used deconstruction and how deconstruction is used as a literary theory. But it is not something that can be defined in strict terms. All right. However, for our viewers who are here to understand what it involves, I have created 10 major sections in this video which deal with all the main aspects of deconstruction and how deconstruction achieves a different way of thinking about language and language use. Within each section, I have taken up explanations and I have given examples, as many as I could within the scope of this video. So I hope it helps. My apologies beforehand to all those who find this video a simplification. I have tried to keep the beginners in mind, and at the end of this video you will find many resources which can be explored if you want to understand deconstruction more critically. All right. So what does deconstruction involve? Deconstruction is the combination of a prefix and a word, the prefix de and construction. But it's not, as you can see, is destruction. It does not involve destructing the text and then coming out with the conclusion that there's no meaning to a text. Actually, Derrida did not mean it that way. Deconstruction does involve breaking down a text, an idea, the conventional obviousness of concepts and structures, and it involves seeing that there are contradictions that emerge in its meaning. All right, but it is sort of a dismantling and then bringing together the elements. Any text, any idea, any concept will be broken down first, will be dismantled first to be constructed again within the deconstructor's own ideology or own subjectivity is what deconstruction tells you. In fact, this is one of the main points of deconstruction, that the person, the critic, the author, the reader, his psyche, his subjectivity, his personality definitely modifies the meaning of the text. So a text, an idea, a concept, a belief, it might seem to have a particular unified meaning on the surface. But a deconstructive perspective helps us to see how a text may have not one but many meanings. A text may not have a unified, but it may have many conflictual, contradictory, opposite meanings that challenge each other. And this process also challenges the belief that a text always has one particular meaning. We've been taught that since the beginning of our education. What does this poem mean? What does this play mean? What does this novel mean? What's the central idea? You remember that, right? In our literary classes, we're always told to find the central ideas. So deconstruction says that this obsession with the central idea can be challenged, and you can see that the central idea is challenged within the text, through the text itself, through the author's words itself, and how meanings can be contradictory and the text may end up having no fixed meaning. It will have a meaning, but the meaning cannot be fixed and it changes from context to context, person to person, nature to nature, ideology to ideology, and so on. So basically, I can summarize that deconstruction may be introduced as Derrida's attempt to bring attention to the process of language use. He tries to throw light on the constructed nature of language, the constructed nature of texts, constructed nature of our identities, and the constructed nature of our ideologies. All right, so without wasting much time, let's dive right into the first point. Deconstruction versus structuralism. So the first thing we need to know, the beginners need to know about deconstruction is that it is often understood as Derrida's critique of the structuralist tendencies, structuralist processes. But first, we have to introduce what structuralism actually involved. Structuralism was a school of thought that was developed by the linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, and it advocated that if we study language as a system, we shall find that there are underlying principles that govern its composition. And it's not only language. Any system can be studied, and we can study the surface of any system, and then we might be able to find underlying principles of any system. Every system is governed by some underlying principles that can be found if we study the surface of the structure. Right? So structuralism is understood as a systematic way to understand the underlying structures, the underlying patterns behind all human experience. All right. Structuralism is understood to have two levels. There's one visible surface phenomena, which is visible. We can see it. Yes, we can experience it, and one invisible structural system, which is there and which is underlying to be discovered. Structuralism also understands language as a system of signs, S-I-G-N-S, signs. Structuralism as language as a system of signs, where there's a signifier, which is the form of the word, and there's a signified, which is the meaning of the word, the essence of the word. So as you can clearly see that there's a binary at work here between the signifier and the signified, and this binary also carries a hierarchy. What is a binary? It means thinking in terms of two opposites like truth and lie, light and darkness, and black or white. You see that these are opposite terms, and you will also see that one term from these is privileged. In truth and lie, truth is privileged. In light and darkness, light is privileged. In black and white, white has often been considered privileged. Similarly, in structuralism, there's a binary. The form is underprivileged, the content is more privileged. The signifier remains lesser in importance to the signified. The word, the body of the text remains lesser in importance to the meaning and the essence of the word. All right. So now Derrida pointed out what all was wrong in such binaries, and you'll get a detailed explanation of this in the oncoming points. Another problem that post-structuralists like Derrida found in structuralism is that structuralism tried to seek an order, to find a structure to texts. It tried to find patterns and motifs with the help of various tools like imagery, symbolism, tone, rhyme, tension, ambiguity, paradox, and all these tools, they were all used in the aim of finding the one central idea, the one true unified meaning of the text. Derrida, through deconstruction, challenges the notion that meaning is right there in the text to be just found through analysis. Derrida does not believe that meaning is an essence of the text, something that is metaphysical, something just beyond words, and something non-linguistic which is just there to be found. So Derrida, although he never accepted himself to be a post-structuralist, but since his critique is emerging out of the structuralist ideas, is directed at the structuralist processes, he is often considered a post-structuralist. That's the first point. The second point which might also be considered as the crux of the deconstructive practice, might also be considered the root of the deconstructive practice, and is enough to understand how deconstruction is done to texts. The second point is no final meaning. Deconstruction is a method of reading that proves that the idea of one stable, single, coherent, unified meaning, this idea of a singular meaning, is a myth. Deconstruction shows that every text, no matter how obvious, simple, naturally true, or straight its meaning sounds, the text will have conflicting forces operating within it. The meaning that the author is trying to make is generally betrayed by a closer reading of the text. The relationship between the signifier and the signified is not stable, it's not simple, it's not unidimensional, one-on-one. Okay, it's not only unstable, the meaning is not only unstable, the central idea is not only unstable, it changes from person to person, it changes from place to place, ideology to ideology, culture to culture, and whatnot. All right. So let's take up a very simple example of how meaning changes from situation to situation without even changing a single syllable in a sentence. I'm taking this example from my favorite critical theory writer, Louise Tyson, because her example is utterly simple and very interesting, and I found it almost impossible to find a better example than this. So I'm picking up her example from the book. The example says that the sentence that I'm going to speak changes meaning with every use, and we'll see how. The sentence is, time flies like an arrow, right? So time flies like an arrow, simple, time passes really quickly, that's the meaning, right? Now this simple sentence, time flies like an arrow, who would doubt that this sentence has any other meaning? Can you find another meaning in this sentence? Time flies like an arrow, time flies like an arrow, it's so simple. But you will see that in the second usage, if I say time flies like an arrow, and time is not a noun but a verb, like timing flies. What I'm doing, I'm timing flies. Flies are flying. What I'm doing is I'm timing them. I have a stopwatch and I'm observing how fast they fly, like I observe arrows, of course. So I ask you as well to time flies like an arrow. And here, just by making time the verb and flies the noun, I change the meaning of the sentence without even putting a comma or deleting a comma from it. Next, time flies like an arrow. If time flies was one thing, like fruit flies or house flies or butterflies or any kind of fly, time flies was a kind of flies. So they like an arrow. Time flies are very fond of arrows, all right? If you visit their houses, they'll have a bunch of collections of arrows in their houses. So time flies like an arrow. So time flies are very fond of arrows, and that's how there emerges another meaning of the same sentence. We saw that by not even changing a single syllable, the meaning of the sentence changes completely, because every word carries other meanings with it. We'll later on discuss the concept of trace. Derrida gives a concept of trace where every word carries the history of its usage, and thus always creates a possibility of an alternative meaning through the historical meanings that it has acquired over time. Now I shall show you how changes in tone of voice and changes in stress can change the meaning of a sentence without even changing a single letter in it. Alright, imagine the voice of a newsreader reading the following. The Prime Minister says, the soldiers do not have to go to the China border. All right, simple sentence. The Prime Minister has given a statement that the soldiers do not have to go to the China border. Now you will see how the meaning changes dramatically as I change the stress that I put on different parts of the sentence. So I read, the Prime Minister says the soldiers do not have to go to the China border. By putting stress on says, I am doubting the Prime Minister. He just says, but maybe he means something else. The Prime Minister says the soldiers do not have to go to the China border. It implies that he might be just making a false promise or is perhaps lying. All right. In the second sentence, the same sentence, but in the second way of using it, I say, the Prime Minister says the soldiers do not have to go to the China border. Prime Minister says the soldiers do not have to go to the China border. It means the Prime Minister is fed up of explaining again and again that they do not have to go to the China border. Maybe he's correcting a false rumor which is going on and which says that the Prime Minister is sending all the soldiers to the China border. In the next usage, Prime Minister says the soldiers do not have to go to the China border, implying that maybe the doctors have to go to the China border, maybe the ministers will have to have a meeting at the China border, maybe the chief of army has to go, but the soldiers do not have to go to the China border. In the next usage, Prime Minister says the soldiers do not have to go to the China border. The Prime Minister says the soldiers do not have to go to the China border. It implies that some other person said that they had to go and now the Prime Minister is correcting the information. Okay, so in the next usage, it says the Prime Minister says the soldiers do not have to go to the China border. The Prime Minister says the soldiers do not have to go to the China border. It implies that they might have to go to the other borders, but not the China border. In the last usage, it says the Prime Minister says the soldiers do not have to go to the China border. They don't have to go to the China border. It implies that the soldiers can go if they wish, but there's no compulsion for them. There's no orders for them to just pack up their bags and leave for the China border. So you see, by changing stress points, by changing the emphasis on different words, you see the focus is shifting, and as the focus shifts, the implication of the sentence shifts. We get different meaning, different connotations out of every sentence as we change the points of emphasis in a sentence. So by now I've given you two ways in which meaning changes. One is where time flies like an arrow, where the different words function differently and the meaning changes because they carry the trace of meanings that they've acquired over time. In the second one, I've changed the emphasis, and by changing the emphasis, the meaning of the words change. Meaning of the sentences change, Now let's look at another level. Deconstruction believes that language does not refer to fixed things. Language is slippery and ambiguous. The concept of difference is very important for deconstruction, and let's see how difference works. The word bat, as the famous example goes, the word bat is bat because it is not cat or rat or hat or so on. The bat has meaning by virtue of its difference from other words, is what structuralism as well as post-structuralism believes. Also, if bat and bat are two different words, one bat is the wooden bat and the other bat is the organism, the creature. They have the same spelling, the same structure, the same surface that we have to observe. Which meaning will you bring out of it? Their meaning will be judged by the reader according to the context. If I say that the Chinese people ate bats, and that is doubted to be one of the main reasons of the COVID-19 pandemic. So are they eating wooden bats or they're eating the creatures? The meaning will be decided by the person who is actually aware. Maybe someone might judge that the Chinese people are fond of eating wooden equipment and because they eat anything. So I'm sorry for that statement. I apologize. But actually, Bat and bat are two words with the same spellings and different meaning. Their meaning would be defined by the reader according to the context, and this is how meaning further can change in this way. Alright, so the meaning of the word will depend on the situation on which it is being used. So by now we have seen three ways in which meanings change. Time flies like an arrow, the PM sentence, and then the bat example. Now, deconstruction, as I said, also believes that the reader plays an important role in producing meaning. A reader can deduce something different. He can read something different into a text than what was meant by the author. He doesn't have to really care about the author, about what the author actually wanted to mean through a work. The author, his intention, his desire, his objective is not primary in deconstructive practice. We do consider it, we do try to see how he means what he means, but our major intention is to find other interpretations and to see how the author's intention is challenged by those other interpretations, and then those interpretations are also challenged by other interpretations, and how we end up having different meanings which are conflictual. Also, when you read Robert Frost's Mending Wall, I'm giving an example for this. The message seems to be that the speaker does not like walls. The speaker of the poem is modern, he's open-minded, he has evolved with time, and he sees that the wall is not required any longer. It has served its purpose. The neighbor of the speaker, on the other hand, appears to be fixed. He appears to be rigid, he appears to be traditional, and he insists on keeping the wall. But on a closer reading, as Louise Tyson has done, we find that there are many ways in which this binary between the speaker and the neighbor, this binary between modern and tradition, is challenged. First of all, we can prove that there are many ways in which modernity may not be such a good thing. The speaker does not deserve so much appreciation for being so modern. There are so many things which are very good in the traditional lifestyle, the natural, the primitive lifestyle. Alright, there are many ways in which the speaker may be wrong and the neighbor may be right. Then we find how in some ways the speaker may be right but the neighbor wrong, and how it becomes difficult to reach a solid, simple, straight meaning of the text. Meanings may be overlapping, they may be conflicting. A final meaning may not be white or black, it could be a little gray. There's no final, authentic, authoritative meaning to a text. Then there's connotative meaning. Meaning, when I say Rita is a total cat, this could mean Rita is the name of my cat. It could mean that she is as swift as a cat. She may be as cunning as some people perceive cats to be. Or she may be calm as a cat, zen-like as a cat. So when I say Rita is a total cat, although I use it metaphorically, it may carry many meanings that the word cat has acquired over time, and all connotative meanings operate in this way. So Derrida maintains that when we use one word, all the meanings that the word has ever acquired hang on to it and complicate the idea of a stable meaning. Every word carries with itself what Derrida calls trace, the trace of any meaning it has acquired. With it, it carries the possibility to challenge the meaning the author is trying to make. So, traces of previous meanings travel along the words, and similar meanings as well as different meanings are carried along, and thus meaning as a final concept is perpetually deferred, it's suspended, it's always still to come, because we don't know what traces the word has acquired and what traces it will acquire with the coming time. So previous meanings as well as future meanings are carried along within a word, and thus meaning becomes an infinite play of signifiers rather than in stable relation with a particular signifier. There's no one-to-one correspondence between signifier and the signified. Arrival at a final meaning is a myth and should be challenged. So we proved it by so many different types of meaning, where number one, where words perform different functions; number two, where stress was changed and meaning got changed; number three, same words were used but they carried different meanings and therefore meanings changed. Then readers make different meanings, different interpretations than the author, and then we saw how connotative meanings challenge the idea of a stable meaning. So you see how meaning is not a stable element residing in the text for us to uncover or passively consume. Meaning is produced by the play of language through the vehicle of the reader. Language is much less stable than we often consider, and through deconstructive lens, it begins to look like a sprawling, like a spread out, limitless web of meanings where there's constant interchange and circulation of elements, where none of the elements is absolutely definable and where everything is caught up and traced through by everything else, like the signifiers and signified are in a very complicated, very spread out, very sprawling web-like relationship. And therefore, if someone says that the meaning of something is final, meaning of a religion is final, meaning of an idea is final, meaning of a philosophy is final and cannot be questioned, then we should challenge that idea itself, because meaning is made through language and language is not stable. The third point states everything is language. Deconstruction tells us that language constitutes the basis of our understanding. This world that we are in, this world as we understand it, is an infinite text. Whatever you understand or know or think about is in terms of language. Don't you agree? Even your own self, in your understanding, is made up of words and only words. When you think about yourself, when you try to reflect, you look into what's going on in your mind, what do you observe, right? And how do you observe? You do that through words. Words, we are made physically, but we understand ourselves through and through language. Our thoughts, our identity, our self-image, our views and opinions about ourselves as well as the world are all constituted through language. It's all constituted through words. So I can never fully meet and know my real essence without using words that describe concepts to our mind. Even with people who don't use words, who don't use the verbal language like us, even they have some signs through which they communicate and understand. So we need signs, words, sentences, language whenever we need to know anything in this world, including our own selves. So may I go on to conclude that given the unstable and slippery nature of language, the never final nature of language, I will never experience a true self outside of words, that my true self, whatever it is comprised of language, and language is unstable. So how I understand myself, my self-conception is unstable. We can never have a pure, unblemished meaning or experience at all. Even Barthes has said that we have a world at all because we have a language to signify it. Language is what forms us, and there is no way to get beyond it. We exist, we think, we feel within language, into the language into which we are born. Language is the tool that mediates our experience of ourselves and the world. So we can say that language is thus the basis of our being, but since language is an unstable play of meaning, we as a concept are also an unstable play of meaning. We cannot understand the final meaning of who we are, what our essence is, what is the meaning of our existence, because it is all comprised of language, and language is unstable. With this, in connection, we come to the next point, which says our identity is also a myth. I hope you are getting a hint how the 2 points are connected. See, human beings perceive themselves through words and language. We just talked about it. They may also be considered as texts. What are we? We are text. We just proved that we are conflicted, unstable, fragmented, and definition by nature. If we are texts and texts are unstable, so you think every person has a unified, stable, final, fixed identity, we need to think again. We, like literary texts, are unstable and ambiguous. The self-identity, the self-image, the stable identity we think we have is a comforting delusion. And this how does this happen? How do we get an illusion that we have a fixed identity? Culture. Culture makes us believe that our identities are absolute and fixed, that either one can be a pure Hindu or one can be a pure Muslim, one can be purely Indian or purely Pakistani. Identities can be on the basis of religion, on the basis of region, countries, on the basis of classes. One can be a higher class or one can be working class. Rigid identities are imposed upon us and we never question them because our culture taught us that that's who we actually are, and it's not something to question because that's the truth. The idea of truth is one of the privileged essences that we talked in the beginning, the signified, the underlying principles that we think we cannot question. But what is truth and what is not is told to us by our culture. And culture is language, and language is unstable. So our identities are also unstable, you see. Critical approaches like deconstruction make us question concepts like this. They tell us that we consist of multitudes. We have multiple fragmented selves. Our beliefs, our desires, our fears and our anxieties are conflicting. Sometimes we find ourselves believing one thing and sometimes the exact opposite of it. Sometimes I desire one thing and sometimes I desire the opposite of it. Sometimes I'm afraid of something and sometimes I don't realize that I was afraid of that thing. So I am not a fixed identity, right? Human beings are fragmented battlefields of competing ideologies. I am made of different ideologies. Sometimes I'm a feminist and sometimes I find myself being a big hypocrite when it comes to feminism, right? Because feminism is not something pure, something fixed that you can just adopt and be. All right, we internalize ideologies through language, through culture. Culture is the one who denies us the fragmented experience produced by fragmented language. It tells us we are this or that we are stable identities, stable personalities, but actually none of this is true. A refusal to accept given identities is one of the trademarks of post-structuralist thinking and deconstructive practice. It developed in the 1960s, and you know the 60s were turbulent times. People were questioning, people in the universities were questioning given concepts. So deconstruction is one of them, and it tells us that identity is a process. It's a becoming and not being. It is a negotiation and not a fixed product. Let's come to the next point, which says that deconstruction believes in refuting logocentrism. Now, what is logocentrism? I am not going to define, at least in this video. All right, it may involve two things. Let's just discuss it and not try to define it. First, in the Western philosophy, the spoken word is considered privileged over the written word. This is a piece of information that I am giving you. In the Western philosophy, the spoken word is often privileged over the written word. The spoken word is always considered as in someone is living who's speaking it. An actual life is there with the spoken word, whereas the written word is considered to be associated with an absence of a real speaker or a real consciousness. It stands for some impersonal lifelessness. Also, the written word threatens because it can be circulated, used in whatever way the author did not mean. It can be reproduced, it can be cited in ways out of the speaker's control. So in the Western tradition, in other words, the live voice is celebrated over the written word. You see, again, a binary between the spoken and the written, in which the spoken is privileged than the written. And since it's a binary, we'll see that Derrida is going to challenge it. Reconstruction is going to challenge it. This is what the first meaning of, first aspect of the logocentrism that we talked about. The second is that logocentrism signifies that the whole Western culture, its philosophies, its language is centered around logos, which in Greek means word or presence or a transcendental signified. What is a transcendental signified? The transcendental signified stands for the meaning that surpasses everything, that transcends everything, that is beyond everything, that's just there, the metaphysical meaning that is there and is waiting to be discovered, and obviously waiting to be discovered through language. So logocentrism attempts to understand and explain the world on the basis of stable, transcendental concepts like truth, like God, like the self, like reason. Now, who would question the concept of reason? Everybody considers reason to be a very good thing, a very good tool to judge people with. This is reasonable and this is not reasonable. Men are considered to be reasonable, women are considered to be not reasonable, right? So reason is something that is given extreme privilege, extreme honor in the Western philosophy and in the Enlightenment philosophy especially. These are some concepts which are considered absolute and are beyond questioning because they are understood to be transcendental. They are understood to be beyond everything, existing metaphysically, existing beyond language. So these concepts and concepts like this have found our whole system of thought. It is beyond the system of language. It is undisturbed by the play of linguistic differences. No matter what language we use, how confused we are in defining it, we know that God exists, right? They are above all the discourses, an unquestionable meaning to which all our signs seem to point. It is believed that these transcendental concepts must have existed before all discourses. These are the meaning of all the meanings, the linchpin of our whole thought system. Deconstruction challenged this. It rejects this emphasis on centers and origins and essences. In other words, it rejects the emphasis on logos and logocentrism. All right. According to deconstruction, no concept is outside the slipperiness of the confusion, of the ambiguity, fluidity of language. Certain meanings like family, democracy, humanity, independence and justice and order are declared transcendental by the society, are elevated by social ideologies to a privileged position. These concepts may also be referred to as first principles. Deconstruction believes that these first principles may also be deconstructed. These principles are not beyond challenge. We can, of course, question them. We can, of course, question them because they are also understood through language, and language means 100 number of things. So how can these concepts may mean anything metaphysical, anything beyond language? So these concepts can also be questioned as a product of a particular system of meaning. They can be understood as particular product of particular ideology that favors those in power. For example, the idea of a family system is central to a society. A family structure with a male at the top, a female who joins the male, then they procreate and they raise a family. It is very convenient for the overall objectives of a society. So it's not to be questioned. It's the transcendental principle. Whoever refuses to follow this system is termed as an outcast and is isolated. You remember how the neighborhood auntie asks your age and tells you to get married as soon as possible, because not being married, then they are ready to term you as an outcast, as a bigda hua bachcha, as a person who's just beyond control. So no one questions concepts like family. right? Family, the system may have some pros, it may have some cons, it may have some negative and positive points both. So why can't we question it? Why can't we show the negative sides as well? Why can't a person choose something which is against the transcendental signified? So deconstruction equipped us to see the logocentrism inherent in our social structures and allowed us to question concepts like this. Deconstruction thus becomes a tool to question the transcendental signified. It becomes a tool to question the first principles and the logocentrism of the Western philosophical tradition. The next point says that deconstruction rejects binary oppositions. I'm going to keep this one quick and short because we've already discussed this and we don't want a longish video which people are afraid to see the duration of. So according to structuralism, every text is made up of binary oppositions and meaning is the result of the play of these binaries as we saw. So you will see a binary opposition between reason and emotion, between masculine and feminine, between civilized and primitive, between objective and subjective. You will also see that one part of this binary is always privileged. These binaries subsequently give birth to oppositions like man against woman, human against animal, white against black, Aryans against the Jews, purity against impurity, and so on. So according to structuralism, we can always arrive at a unified meaning of the text by reading closely and finding which part of the binary the text favors, right? But deconstruction teaches us to find overlapping elements within opposite categories, a way to show that the boundaries between these binaries are not so clear or well defined or final. Rather, they are shifting. The boundaries are blurred. They are unclear. For example, woman is the opposite of man. She is the other of man. In a way, if you understand it this way, she is considered to be a defective man. What woman is something that the man is not. Right? It has a negative value concept to the male first principle. Man also has to maintain himself as the man by virtue of this opposition. Oh, come on, why are you being so woman-like? Oh, come on, why are you being so sissy? Right? So he has to maintain his masculinity by the virtue of this opposition. He will be the man by not being the woman. So the woman is not just opposite of man, but she is also what the man is not. Therefore, man needs this other to show what he is not. So the man is parasitically dependent upon the woman. He is dependent upon the act of excluding and subordinating her. So this exclusion is necessary because she may not be quite the other after all. Why is this exclusion so necessary? Why do humans have to prove that they are not animal-like? Because they are animals. Because there's a particle of man and woman in all of us, as we've proved in psychoanalysis. So the other may not be the other after all. Woman stands for something in man himself which he needs to repress, he needs to expel, he needs to eliminate beyond his own being. I'm so sorry, Dodo gets really vocal when it comes to feminist issues, so please excuse her. Alright, so where were we? That she stands for something in man himself which he needs to repress and expel and terminate. This is perhaps because what he's trying to terminate is what is inside himself. What is so alien to him is also intimate. So much so that he needs to guard himself against any womanliness. The binary, in other words, is much less absolute, much less clear than it appears. Ideologies and cultures, they like to draw rigid boundaries between what is acceptable and what is not, between the self and the other, truth and falsity, between reason and emotion, between the central and marginal, between the surface and the depth. But through deconstruction, we question first principles and we begin to unravel these oppositions and show the contradictory meaning that emerges when we peel out the ideological layer of language, the words that form language. With this, we come to the next point, which is deconstruction reveals the ideological nature of language. So we saw that language is purely ideological. Whatever you say, not only your sentences and words, but also your tone, your gestures, intonation and style, how you respond to every single thing that happens to you or is said to you, it can never be free from the underlying ideologies that you may have acquired culturally. You may have acquired them consciously or unconsciously. Language consists entirely of many conflicting, dynamic, changing ideologies and the systems of beliefs and values. These ideologies and systems operate all the time in any culture. Right? For example, a kiss on the cheek between a man and a woman is completely okay in the West, but is unthinkable even between a couple in public in a country like India. If a girl has a number of boyfriends, she is called a slut. But if a boy has a lot of girlfriends, he is considered a stud. How anything is received, is understood, depends upon the underlying ideologies. One should always be alert to the ideologies operating behind whatever you are told. All right? Signs pass themselves as the only final way of seeing the world. Signs are authoritarian and they are ideological. If one belief system tells you that only and only your religion is absolutely pure and absolutely right, there's the ideology. It is ideological. If someone tells you that so and so is the only right way to think, is the only right way to talk, is the only right way to behave and to believe, you know there's ideology operating within it. They will say it in a way that it seems natural. It is natural that a woman is made to stay at home and raise kids. It is natural that kids don't question their parents. It is natural that your religion is the only good religion in the world. It is one of the functions of ideology to naturalize things, to make it seem innocent and unchangeable, just like nature cannot be changed. So ideology seeks to convert cultural items into natural items, cultural tools into natural concepts, and the sign, the language is one of its weapons. How does it do it? It does it through language. All right. It appears so natural. It appears that some ideas cannot be questioned, some views are final, when in reality they are only ideological and have been ingrained into our psyche through culture. Everything we took for granted as true, natural, obvious was already deeply questionable, was already deeply ingrained in our ideology, and deconstruction equips us to see that and question ideology. With this, we come to the next point, which is how deconstruction and literature enrich each other. So in literature, deconstruction allows you to see how meaning is not a stable element. You will be quite familiar with this by now. It is created by the reader in the act of reading. Language is carried on, the language play is carried on through the reader. Literary texts, like all texts, consist of many overlapping meanings in a dynamic and fluid relation to one another and to us. No interpretation is final interpretation. We have to pay attention to the neglected parts of a text, things that have never been doubted until recently with the help of these post-structuralist tools. For example, when I read Jane Eyre for the first time, and I did not know post-colonial theory and not much of the feminist theory, I thought that Jane Eyre is one of the most wonderful texts that highlight the struggles of a woman in the Victorian times. And yet, later on I found that the text defeats its own purpose when we consider how conveniently Bertha Mason was excluded from that consideration just because she was a woman of color. It is only when we question seemingly stable claims of a text that we see hidden meanings. We find texts defeating their own purpose. For example, when our Prime Minister did a Bhumi Pujan for the site of the Parliament building, it was celebrated, it was hailed as worthy. But don't we see an act of exclusion in this when we don't take other cultures apart from Hinduism into account? The Parliament belongs to the country and the country is secular. Why start something in a secular country with a gesture that is utterly Hinduist? Right? So thus every reading is subjective. It is ideologically produced by a culture's values and beliefs, and it's so ingrained that we consider them natural. There's the author's subjectivity, there's the reader's subjectivity, and there's the critic's subjectivity, and all these subjectivities are also constructed. Even they can be questioned. It means that the reader, the author, and the critic are products of their circumstances. Whatever they read and state are also conclusions that come out of their subjectivity, their individuality, and their ideologies. We should keep this in mind while deconstructing a literary work. And the most important part is that we should also consider our own position in relation to it, right? We should also consider that what we think and what we are inferring from a text is also impacted by our personalities, our ideologies. The next point says how we deconstruct. While applying deconstruction to a text, we can show how the binaries are challenged, how the binaries are questioned because they are overlapping. We show how the reader produces his own meaning. We show that the meaning that the reader creates is not a stable element capable of producing closure, that no interpretation has the final word. We can show how texts conflict their own ruling systems of logic, and deconstruction shows this by analyzing the points. We should bring out the undecidability of the text. We should focus on this word, undecidability. It's not that there is no meaning in the text. Of course, there are many meanings in the text, but the meanings are, the final meaning has the element of undecidability to it, all right? And we can show the complex operations of ideology within texts. So let's go to this one by one. Number first, how do we prove the undecidability of the text? What we do is we note all interpretations, like the first one through new criticism, which shows the central theme of the text. I'm sorry for the interruption. This will go on in this house. So anyway, we should note all interpretations, I'm sorry. Whatever interpretations we are able to find, 1, 2, 3, we can show how these interpretations conflict each other. We go on and find more interpretations, and then again we prove they are in conflict to each other. More conflicts, more interpretations. There's an endless chain between interpretations and the conflict that there can be in among them. All right, like within a class, if you discuss an idea, every student may come up with their own interpretation, and the interpretations may be quite conflictual. So the meaning of the text is rendered undecidable. So after proving the undecidability of the text, the second thing we can do while deconstructing, we can show the ideological assumptions behind the text, and deconstruction is the most important tool for this. So first we go through a new critical reading, which gives you a central theme, the central tension within the text, the most obvious meaning of the text. Meaning here appears as a unified whole. Alright, so although the new critical reading employs all these tools, it's all the tools of paradox and imagery and symbolism, which might look conflicting, it still supports the idea of a main theme of the text. The conflicting meaning and the main theme, all formal elements contribute to a single central theme if we read a text from new critical perspective. In other words, the new critic makes an effort, intentional or otherwise, to hide the ideological assumptions of the work, right? So what we do through deconstruction, we find the overlapping meanings, we find the challenging of the truths. All right, the deconstructionist readings bring out the interpretations, the contradictory interpretations, and defeats the text's main purpose to show that there's a single theme or single unified idea, and deconstruction shows that there can be many meanings and they can be contradictory and they may not support each other. You can also analyze the hierarchy to reverse the hierarchy. For example, in the mending wall, there's a hierarchy. The speaker is privileged and the neighbor is considered primitive. We can find the hierarchy, analyze it, and then we can reverse the hierarchy. We can show how the elements of the hierarchy are constitutive of each other, how the speaker and the neighbor, they both constitute the charm of the poem, and both are right in their own way and both are wrong in their own way, and how these categories are overlapping and there is no fixed hierarchy, right? We show how the form and content of the work to prove that there is no hierarchy, they both are constitutive of each other. This is the second thing that we can do while deconstructing texts. The third thing we can do is that we can refute binaries. We can find binaries in the text, we can challenge binaries, we can show how they are not separate categories but interconnected, inclusive, ambiguous, not so clear. Right? Even when a text appears to privilege one party over the other, deconstruction shows how the less privileged term is actually the central term, right, is actually the dominant term. And then we can again refute this hierarchy and show how the dominant one is perhaps the central and the less dominant one is marginal. So thus we believe in reversing hierarchies, we believe in deconstruction and refuting of binaries, right? When you go to watch a movie in the theater, how do you privilege the movie or do you privilege the numbering? Of course, in a mainstream culture, the movie is privileged and the numbering does not matter. But without the numbering, how would you know from where the movie starts and where it ends? One wouldn't know the actual substance of the movie and how it ended. Without the numbering, a movie will just proliferate its borders. The numbering separates one movie from the other. It separates the movie from the names. All right, and the numbering also works to tell us about the producers, about the people who have contributed. The numbering isolates the movie from every other thing that will appear on the screen, like there were ads. How do we consider the movie is not over once we see the ads? We only consider the movie to be over when we see the numbering in the end. The hierarchy between the movie and the numbering is reversed. But without the movie, if we see a numbering sequence, it is of no value, right? What are the names that you're looking at? Why should one look at those names at all? They have no value. It is the movie that renders the numbering valuable. So the hierarchy is undecidable. All right, it does not mean that the reader is unable to choose, but it means that the text is unclear, the hierarchy is unclear, the binary is unclear. So these are a number of things that we can do while deconstructing a text. So the last point comes to what is the result of deconstructing a text. This will be pretty easy and quick because we are just summarizing of what we've done till now. What is the result of deconstructing a text? One, we reveal the text's undecidability. We reveal that meaning is indefinite. Second, we prove that there are internal contradictions rather than unity of meaning in a text. Third, we reveal the complex operations of ideologies, cultural ideologies, political ideologies, social, religious ideologies of which the text is constructed. And when I say text is not only about text, it's about human experience, it's about social phenomena, it's about political processes. A text could be anything according to deconstruction. And lastly, what's the result of deconstructing a text? We become aware of our own position as a writer, as a critic, as a reader, as an author. Our position is not beyond questioning. When we conclude something, when we infer something, we should always keep in mind that our ideology is also impacting what we are thinking and what we are concluding. So this wraps up all the 10 points. I'm going to give you a quick revision and then you will see a slide in which I have jotted down all the major sources of further exploration if you want to go ahead and read or watch some videos on deconstruction. I'll quickly revise it, the 10 points. First, I gave a quick introduction where I said that deconstruction was developed by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida in his 1967 book called Of Grammatology. The first point said that deconstruction is a post-structuralist concept. So we showed how deconstruction versus structuralism works. Next, we showed the most important thing about deconstruction, that there is no final meaning. Then we proved that everything is constituted of language. Then we proved that our identity is a myth. Then we showed how deconstruction refutes logocentrism. Then we showed how deconstruction rejects binary oppositions. Then we shows how everything is so ideological in nature because everything is constituted of language and language is ideological in nature. Then we showed you how deconstruction and literature are interrelated and how it's actually done is showed in the next point. And in the last point we showed what are the various things that we did when we deconstructed and what is the result, how are we enriched after deconstructing a text. And here's the final slide where there are books and essays and YouTube videos on deconstruction. I'm not describing them because it will add to the duration of the video, and I tried really hard to keep it short and it's still not short. So thanks so much for giving so much of time and patience for my video. I hope this helped. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to mention them in the comment box. Thanks a lot. Please consider sharing the video and subscribing to my channel. Have a very good day. Thank you.